Greetings. Let me greet everyone. Welcome to Patrick Henry College. My name's Graham Walker, president of the college, and it's my pleasure to welcome all of you here. Students, some of our faculty and staff, friends from the local community, I think, are here too. Glad to see you all. Also, we have a good number of people who tune in via our live webcast. I want to welcome them also. And, of course, ultimately, we'll be joined in this event by some 400,000 readers of World Magazine who will read the written version of this interview in an upcoming issue, I presume. Of course, we do this regularly here at Patrick Henry College because we have the privilege of having on our faculty the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, Dr. Marvin Olasky. Dr. Olasky is a member of our faculty, holds the Distinguished Chair in Journalism and Public Policy here at Patrick Henry College. It's a great pleasure to have him on our faculty. Many of our students work with him, learn from him, have interesting internships with him, and other members of his staff. So we're very happy to have you with us, Dr. Olasky. We're also happy to have as your guest today, Dr. David Jeremiah. I welcome you personally to Patrick Henry College, too. Dr. Jeremiah is the pastor of Shadow Mountain Community Church, one of the largest churches in San Diego area in California. He's the chancellor of San Diego Christian College, and he founded Turning Point Ministries, a 30-minute radio program heard on over 2,500 stations worldwide. I suspect that a number of your listeners are in this audience. Turning Point also launched a television program that close to 200 million homes have access to. Dr. Jeremiah has authored over 20 books, and some of his books have made the New York Times, USA Today, and Wall Street Journal bestseller lists. He co-authored a devotional called The Secret of the Light with well-known artist Thomas Kinkade. Dr. Jeremiah speaks frequently at Cedarville University, Dallas Theological Seminary, Moody Bible Institute, at the Billy Graham Training Center, and also at many NFL, NBA, and baseball chapels. He earned his master's degree in theology from Dallas Theological Seminary and was granted the Doctor of Divinity degree from Cedarville. So please give a warm welcome to Marvin Olasky and Dr. David Jeremiah.
Well, thank you very much for coming from beautiful San Diego to snowy Purcellville, Virginia.
I haven't seen that in years until this morning.
So, you grew up in Ohio at Cedarville. In fact, there are a lot of students here who are PKs, pastor's kids, but you were a double PK. You were a pastor's kid and also a president's kid.
That's right.
So what was that like growing up?
Well, it was interesting, and I remember one day when I was thinking about all of the issues that had to do with being the son of the president of the college I attended, and then I began to think about some of the perks, and I decided to embrace the perks and forget about the rest of it, and it was a lot better after that.
And the perks were?
I lived at home, so I didn't have to be in at the same time everybody else did. I actually got good food to eat and other things like that.
Right. And what were the downsides?
If something wasn't right in the school, or if somebody didn't like something, they thought I could fix it. They thought I could get my dad to fix it, so they would come and rag on me for a while about it, or they would be critical. And one of the real issues when you're the son of an important person is that people are always looking at you, believing that you're being given special treatment because of who you are, whether you are or not. So you're always having, and even in my family, I used to tell my boys who were athletes, you got to be a little bit better than everybody else. You got to be almost twice as good as everybody else, so nobody will ever question that you should be on the field or you should be on the court.
Right. And then Dallas Theological Seminary. And then starting a small church that with a few families in a mobile home, right?
Actually, I did that. Yeah, after I graduated from seminary, I went to Haddon Heights, New Jersey to be a youth pastor.
Okay.
And I was there for about 2 years, and I really got a desire to preach. A friend of my family's in Fort Wayne, Indiana, was starting churches all around, long before the multi-site churches started. Back in the 60s and 70s, he was building a ring of churches around Fort Wayne, just starting branch churches, and they were getting ready to start a new one, and he called me and asked me if I wanted to be a part of it. It's a long story. I really wasn't on my list of things I ever wanted to do, but we went back there and met the 7 couples who were going to be a part of this, and God worked in our heart to make us willing to do it, and we did.
And then it just grew.
We were there for 12 years, and we started, I remember the first Sunday I preached in that mobile home, there were 35 people. And I gotta honestly tell you, I thought, is this what I went to seminary for? Preached to 35 people in a mobile home. But God really used that. And one of the things that happened was I was one of the early adopters for the Evangelism Explosion program that came out of Jim Kennedy. Even before the book was printed, I learned the presentation. And I just began to share Jesus Christ with people in homes. I would go and I'd sit down on Friday and make appointments with as many people as I could, and just to go share the gospel with them. We just started having people come to Christ. And then we taught our people how to do it, and the church grew. And when I left, there were about 1,600 people in the church in 1981.
So a real success story there as far as growth, but I'm just wondering, those 35 people, you knew all those 35 people, at least the ones who came back.
In fact, the first week they were there, I pronounced all the men deacons, and I didn't even know if they knew Jesus. I mean, I just needed some deacons.
So, and then it grows and grows and grows, and a great success in many ways, but then how do you know the people?
Well, you know, if you go back to the Black Hawk Baptist Church, which is the church we started in Fort Wayne, we pretty much knew all those people only because I'd led many of them to Christ. I'd baptized them. I'd married them. I'd been with them in their times of joy and in their times of sorrow. And you can know that many people if you start with them, and you know, they kind of come along. But when I left there and went to San Diego with all the people there, that was a real challenge for me. I felt like I didn't know anybody.
So Tim LaHaye has built a big church there, and then he moves on to other things, and you come in with all these people and you don't know them.
And even more important than that, Marvin, was the fact that when I came there, Tim LaHaye had what they called the Scott Memorial Baptist Church, one church in 3 locations. So they had a church in the North County, they had one in the East County, and they had one downtown. And that was before they were using video to do multi-sites, and so he would kind of scurry around. And when I came there for the first year, I preached 5 sermons every Sunday in the different places, and I sometimes didn't know which church I was in. I couldn't remember what I had said in the other church, and did I say the same thing again? So it was very, very confusing, and obviously I knew I couldn't sustain that, so we spun one of the churches off, and I located in the East County and tried to be the pastor of that church.
Okay. And then more people are coming, the church is growing, plus there's a desire of other people, and so you start developing a real ministry by radio and television and so forth. So as all the success is happening, then, I mean, and this is great, I mean, you're spreading the gospel, but something is lost in the process, I would think.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. I mean, I'm sure if you're in a church, everybody would like to feel like they have a close relationship with their pastor. And in churches that are the size of ours, that would be very difficult. And so what you try to do is bring in people who represent you to the congregation, and that you pour yourself into the lives of the people who are around you, so that those people have relationships. And so our pastors and our staff, and even our lay staff, they understand how vital that is. And of course, during that time, the whole small group thing started, and we embraced that, and we just have hundreds and hundreds of people that are in small groups who are finding community there. And my relationship with the people is primarily through the pulpit.
Okay. And then, I mean, as this develops, I'm wondering, here you have a story of one particular church, well, the church in Fort Wayne and then the church in El Cajon, both of which are growing. Can we take that and apply it to the situation of the American Evangelical Church generally, where lots of growth, but sometimes people say it's very shallow growth?
Right.
What do you see as you look around the evangelical church now? What do you see as strengths? What do you see as weaknesses?
You know, I just saw, I get a news service on my phone, and I just saw this last week that we now have 8,000 venues in America. 8,000 venue churches, which is the new thing, you know. one guy preaching and distributing it through the venues. And I've been kind of a late adopter to that. We're going to do it a little bit. Somebody asked me why, and I said, well, I have venues all over the country. Every Sunday I turn on the television, there I am, you know. But I think we have to be a little bit cautious about that, because if we're not careful, you know, we're just franchising things, you know, and we lose the intimacy that we should have in a church. I've seen it where it's done very well, and I've seen it where I've had questions about it. But it is what it is, and today I think technology is giving us opportunities to share the gospel that we've never ever had before, and we don't want to not take advantage of them if we can.
Okay, and we have, I suppose, also in American evangelical life today a certain star system. I mean, you are a star, and people listen to you. People want to read your books, all of which is very positive. You hear things sometimes that the star system can also be destructive in some way. It can lead to cults of personality, and people, in a sense, looking at the stars and thinking, "Wow, these are really special people," and it can go to the head of some of the stars. I mean, how do you guard against that?
Well, first of all, I have a good wife. That's the most important thing, you know. And here's what I believe: if you're involved in a local church and you're really involved in it, and I am, it's my first love. Wherever I'm at, if I have to go somewhere in the country, I go home, and I want to be there on Sunday, and I study hard while I'm gone, so I have something to say to the people when I come home. And I don't ever think of myself as a star. I mean, I've had so many experiences. I'll just tell you one story. It's one of my favorite stories. I was back here in this community, not too far from here, and I love to visit bookstores. I've visited yours today. And I was in this bookstore, and the little girl who was running the store, she came up. She says, "Oh, I can't believe you're in my store. I'm so excited." She says, "Could you just wait here a minute? I'm going to go back and get all my friends." And she went in the back room where all the girls were working back then. They all came out. She says, "Oh, we're so excited you came to the store, and I have these books. Would you sign these books for me?" And she gave me 7 books written by Josh McDowell. And I signed Josh McDowell's name in them and gave them back to her, and she didn't know the difference. No. And I realized that day, you know, I ain't no big deal, you know. and that things like that have happened to me. God has a wonderful way of helping you realize that you are dust, you're clay. Yeah. And not to get impressed with yourself. And I think a local church, I would be more worried about myself if I wasn't anchored to a local church. The local church has got so many problems, and especially in Southern California, we deal with so many issues. When I go home, my life is filled with trying to help solve the problems that people have, and the realization of who they are, in the broken world in which we live. And I just think that helps you not get too carried away with all that's going on around the world because you're involved in it.
By the way, my favorite line from a person who read one of my books, a woman who said, "I really like that book. I read a page every night before I fall asleep." So anyway, I'm sure you've never gotten that compliment.
Oh, no, I have people tell me, "Oh, Dr. Jeremiah, you put me to sleep every night." And I think, well, I tell them I do the same thing to the people on Sunday, so don't feel bad.
And that's even 11 o'clock in the morning. Mm-hmm. So you were telling me before, this is just one fascinating thing about the different ethnic churches, right, that your church helped to sponsor, right. and that's really remarkable. I'd like you to tell that to people.
You know, we live in, I actually am from San Diego, but I'm from El Cajon, which is a Spanish name. And El Cajon's a very small community, about 20 minutes from downtown San Diego. And for reasons we don't know, we are now the second largest home for the Iraqi people. We have 40,000 Iraqi people who live in El Cajon, which makes up about 1/3 of the population. The only city that has more Iraqi people than we do is Dearborn, Michigan. And we didn't realize this was happening. It just sort of happened, and we don't know why it happened. I haven't any understanding, but we realized that God had given us an opportunity to try to minister to these people. Now, Iraqi people are mostly Chaldeans. They're the people that are in our city, and those are sort of Catholic Iraqis. They're not Islamic. but they're very, very culturally together. They many times live in homes with 4 or 5 families in one home, and they use the garage to live in, and they've pretty much taken over downtown. If you go downtown El Cajon, a lot of it's in Arabic. You don't know what you're going into the store unless you can read it. So we started this program, first of all, to try to help them learn English, an ESL program. We have a lot of retired teachers in our congregation, and they began to make available to them in a theater building that was given to us the opportunity to learn English. And some of them got the idea that part of learning English was to read sections of the New Testament. So here we were teaching these Chaldean people English language, and part of the way we did it was to have them read some of the New Testament. Then we started an Arabic church, and we found an Arabic pastor who was very gifted, and we brought him in, and we pay him as a congregation. And he started the Shadow Mountain Arabic congregation. We have about 280 people in the congregation now, many of whom we reached the first time through the English language program. And they occupied one of the theaters in this building until recently. And then, of course, in Southern California, we're 30 minutes from Tijuana, so we have highly concentrated Hispanic congregation, and we have a Hispanic congregation now that's so large we couldn't keep it in the theater, and they meet in our auditorium at 1:30 on Sunday afternoon, and there's about 700 of them. And then we have an Iranian congregation, a Filipino congregation, a Burmese congregation. We have, on a given Sunday, we'll have about 1,400 or 1,500 people in our international congregations. And because all of these people, the adults need the languages, but the children mostly all speak English, we're able to minister to the children together. So we have the most diverse children's ministry you've ever seen in your life, and all these kids come together to learn about Christ and the Word of God. Recently, we've had to sell that building for numerous reasons, and we've relocated all these congregations and spaces that God has provided, and they just continue to grow. And I think the key for us is that we found the pastors, because when we study this in other places, what would happen is there would be a people who would want to meet, but they didn't have strong leadership. And especially in the international ministries, you have to have strong leadership. So we help these guys, and we pay their salaries, so they don't have to worry about paying them. We pay them. And then we meet with them, and we encourage them. And I was telling Marvin earlier that one of the great things is when these people are converted and they're baptized, they all get baptized in the main church at one of our evening services. And one time recently, I was in tears. Is about 5 or 6 Iraqi men gave testimony to their faith in Christ, having come to Christ through the Iraqi congregation of Shadow Mountain Church. They'd heard the gospel and they'd come to Christ, and they got up and told about their faith. And when we have Burmese candidates, and none of them speak any English at all, so we have to translate that. But it's very rare that we have a Sunday without one of the international congregations baptizing somebody, and that just keeps the English congregation all fired up about what we're doing and how exciting that can be. I don't know anything quite like it, and I wish I could tell you I was the architect of it. We just sort of fell into it, and we realized that God had put us in a place where there were a lot of opportunities. Instead of going to the mission field for those people, he brought the mission field to us, and we're trying to be faithful to do that.
Good. Another thing I think folks would find interesting is the process of producing a book. I mean, you've had half a dozen now New York Times bestsellers, and sometimes authors like to claim, I've done this all myself. Your books start with your sermons,
right?
But then there's a whole team of people involved in doing it, and I see that, and actually in the acknowledgments of your books. And perhaps you could explain how that whole process works.
Well, it's very rare that a person will be both gifted as an oral communicator and a written communicator. There are a few people like that. I don't know that I am one. I'm not sure what my gift is in either one of those areas, but my first heart and my first love is to speak to the people that I minister to on Sunday. I love to preach the Word of God. And I kind of got started writing like this. I did a series of messages when I first came to San Diego back in 1981 on the wisdom of God. And one of the publishers of Campus Crusades publishing firm was in the audience, and he said, "Would you mind if we took your sermon material and put it into a book form?" And I didn't know what he meant, but he said, let me work on it. And so he came and got the transcripts, and they had some of their editors put it in more written form. And it was my words, but they made it written instead of, you can't really publish an oral transcript. And so that was the first thing that happened. And then I've loved prophecy from the very beginning, and I taught through the book of Revelation. I remember it took me 42 Sunday nights to get all the way through it. And some of you maybe remember Hal Lindsey wrote a book called The Late Great Planet Earth. And if you look at that book, at the bottom of it, it says, with Carol Carlson. I met Carol Carlson in one of the meetings where I was preaching on prophecy, and she did the same thing. She said, can I take this, can I put this into a booklet form so that we can take your teaching material and make it available in written form? So she took all of my sermons, and of course, 42 sermons won't fit into any major book that you could publish, so she condensed it and brought it together, and I published this book called, I can't remember the name of the book, but it was on Revelation. My wife told me earlier, but believe it or not, it was the best-selling book I ever wrote, and I can't even tell you the name of it. But that was the first thing. And then we came back and we did the same thing with the book of Daniel. That was called The Handwriting on the Wall. And the first one was Escape the Coming Night. That was the name of it. And those two books just went everywhere. People loved the prophecy stuff that I had taught, and she helped me put it into the written form. Now, what Marvin's talking about is what happens now is I'll preach a series of messages, and they always start in the pulpit because that's what I do. I'm a preacher. That's what I know how to do. So I'll research it and preach it and get the points. And when it gets done, then it's transcribed and it's cleaned up first, you know, the stuff that you say that doesn't belong in a transcript. And then I have a couple of guys that I send it to, and I say, hey, look, this is what I got. If you got some ideas of how we can make this better, send it back to me, and they'll send me a story or something or an illustration they think fits, and then it becomes a part of it. And then I have one man who works for me named Bo Sager, who's a Westminster graduate, and he's really a wordsmith, and he'll clean up some of it. And then we have one other guy that looks at it. And my goal is just to take the thoughts of my heart and the preaching that I do and put it in the best written form I can. That's how the book happens. If I didn't do that, there wouldn't be any books. I need a lot of people to help me, and of course I give them all credit, and we're a team that does that together.
So it's somewhat like you'll see sometimes paintings in museums, you know, from the studio of such and such a famous artist, and so forth. So and sometimes the artist would do the face and the hands, but other people would do other stuff.
Yeah, that's what I saw that with my friend that I did my book with, who did art. And a lot of people worked on his art. He didn't paint all those pictures. Yeah.
So just demystifying a little bit the process of authorship here. And now let me ask you the same thing about becoming a bestseller, because there's a regular strategy. I mean, you have to have the product, of course.
Right.
But then there's a regular strategy that folks follow, and perhaps you could explain that.
Well, I think if I could tell this story, I would like to tell it from my perspective. One of the hardest things, if you write and if you really believe that the written word can help people, books go where nothing else can go. They go into prisons. They go. I mean, one year I did a book one year called Captured by Grace, and somebody came forward and gave us enough money. We printed 100,000 copies of that book and sent them to the military all over the world. I remember going to the Pentagon to speak to the chapel there, and they had those books in all of the alcoves all around the Pentagon, and they gave them away to all the military people. And we put a military page in the front of it, and thanking these guys for what they do for us, telling that the grace of God was the greatest thing that ever happened, and we hope this book would be a blessing to them. And so what happens if you just write a book and you don't do anything else, your opportunity for that book to be read by very many people is extremely limited, unless you happen to be, I can't even think of anybody. Maybe Billy Graham. I guess maybe he might be the one who might not, although I know they do a lot of marketing too. Sure. So I remember one day I said to our guys who were on my staff, I said, you know, if we're going to do these books, we have to take responsibility for them. Because what happens if you write a book, often you just give it to the publisher and you say, okay, sell this for me. And what they do is they run it up the flagpole. If anybody salutes, they throw a little money after it. And if nobody does, they just put it in the back list and go on to the next project. So that day, we took charge of our books. And we created, if you came to Turning Point, where our media ministry is now, you would find that probably the catalyst of what we do there is it's all around a book. We release a new book every fall. And around that book are 8 rallies that we do across the country in arenas. Are all the radio programs that are part of that content, all the television programs that are part of that content. We have a magazine that's read by 200,000 or 300,000 people. During the month that book is being released, all the articles, all the devotionals, everything in the book has to do with the content of that book. We make that book the center of everything at Turning Point. And then we have what our guys would call the pre-launch campaign. The book is usually released in the early days of October, and from August 15th through the first day of October, they offer that book through the internet to anyone who will buy it before it's released. We try to get them to pre-buy the book, and in order to do that, we say, if you pre-buy the book, we will open up for you a whole library of digital assets. When we first started doing this, nobody was doing, a lot of people do this now, but the digital assets are chapters out of other books from other people, and we would go to other publishers and say, would you give us a chapter of his book? We want to promote this book, but we're going to give it away. And I remember the last time we did that, we had 187 digital assets that were in this library. So when they pre-order the book, when we get their order, we give them the key, and that opens that asset, and they download all that material. That's motivation for them to do this. And we keep those books as they're ordered until the book is released, and then we push them all through the wicket at the same time. And when that happens, the book gets noticed. And the principle behind it is, and this is not mine, somebody told me this, it's not about the volume, it's about the velocity. It's not about how many you have, it's about how fast they go through the sales program so that they get noticed. One of the challenges if you write as a Christian is that Christian bookstores don't report to any of the bestsellers lists. So you got to build a marketplace in the Barnes and Nobles and the Books A Millions and the Targets and the big houses so that the books get counted. And that was another strategy that our guys took over. And for the first time last year, we sold more books in secular bookstores than we sold in Christian bookstores. And I think that's probably going to be a trend going forward because, as you guys know, Christian bookstores are not doing all that well. Many of them are disappearing from the landscape. And so between the internet sales and books being available in secular stores, that's where the marketplace is.
And I gather to get on the New York Times bestseller list, there are a bunch of secular stores that they count sales there, and so
right.
and so there's a company that'll go in and buy several books right there at each of these bookstores, and that way propel it. The companies that do that spread the release point of these books that are purchased by individuals. They spread the release point so that they can get the attention of the people who. And people say, well, is that legitimate? The bottom line is you're selling these books. They're just not getting noticed. Mm-hmm. And if you want the books to be noticed so that you can reach more people with them, you got to figure out how to do that. I don't know all the ramifications of it, but I know that, again, I want to go back to what I said at the beginning. You can't just write a book and say, I'm not going to have anything to do with marketing. I remember one day I realized if you don't care enough about it to try to figure out how to get it into the hands of other people, nobody else is going to either. And I decided it was too hard to write a book, just to write it and let your friends read it, and then it falls off the end of the table and you go on. So you're welcome to come anytime you want to and visit us, and our guys out there will be happy to show you what they do. This involves, we have an incredible group of videographers who help us. If you've ever watched our television program, you know almost every program is introduced by a vignette, a little 3-minute thing that's geared around the message of it. When I do a new book, they'll create 10 vignettes to introduce every chapter so that every time it comes on the air, it grabs the people's attention and they watch it, and then the book is a part of it. And
marrying all of these technologies that we have today is, somebody asked me if it's fun to write a book, and I told them, no, it's fun to have written a book, but it is fun to market one. I've learned how much fun that is. And in this day and age when we have so many things with the social media, which I'm just now trying to figure out, we have a lot of tools we can use to get the message of the gospel out to people.
And so when you start a new sermon series, that'll eventually become a book, how do you decide what to emphasize? Or put it another way, what theological truths do you see your congregation most concerned with? What should they be concerned with? How much do you have to, in a sense, meet their felt needs? How much can you anticipate what their real needs are, even though they don't actually can communicate that? Just tell us about that process.
Well, I'm going to just tell you what I do, and this is not, everybody's got their own method. I love the Bible, and I love to teach through the Bible. For instance, right now, if you came to Shadow Mountain, I've been in the book of Mark. Last week was number 32 in the book of Mark. And some people say, well, you can't preach from the book of Mark 32 weeks in a row. Well, you can, because the book of Mark's about Jesus Christ and his ministry. And it's exciting, and every week is exciting. And Sunday night, I've not preached from the book of Revelation since the early 80s, so I've gone back and I've preached through the book of Revelation, and I'm on 26 in Revelation. But in the spring and in the fall, I will often take 8 weeks out of that series and do something special. Last year, I wrote a book on fear called What Are You Afraid Of? And so in the spring, I preached 10 messages on fear. And that 10-message series became the book, What Are You Afraid Of?, which was then aired on television in the fall. I preached it in the spring. It gave us time to get it ready, and then all of the vignettes and everything were done for that series, and it was released in the fall. As soon as I got done with that, we also did a small group curriculum, which I'd never done that before, and I had to go in and tape condensed messages on fear and make them available to our small group leaders so they could play them in the home, and we opened up a lot of new small groups doing that. As soon as I'm done with fear, on the last message, I'll say, okay, we're back to Mark next Sunday, and back to Mark we go. We'll finish Mark sometime, and that's just what I've done. I've done that for 32 years at Shadow Mountain Church, and for 12 years before that. And here's what I've learned from that. When you preach consecutively through the Bible, you may think, well, how's that going to help you with what else you're doing? It helps you stay alert to all of the issues that are going on in the lives of people. It keeps you off of your favorite topic. It keeps you from, getting caught up in things where you will be unbound. The Word of God is the most balanced diet you could ever give to people. And so even though I interrupt that process maybe once, sometimes twice a year, but usually once, the calendar year is, by the time you get to Thanksgiving, nothing's going to happen after Thanksgiving till you get to January, because you got Thanksgiving and you got Christmas. And at Shadow Mountain in January, I spend the first 3 Sundays teaching on stewardship. I've done that every year since I've been a pastor. Then we're back to Mark and back to Revelation, and then you get to the summer, and I don't preach on Sunday nights in the summer. We bring in speakers from all over the country for what we call the Summer Bible Conference, and that gives me a little break. But I just want to always keep coming back to the consecutive teaching of the Word of God. And because of that, I've taught through maybe 70% of the Bible in all the years that I've been teaching. And just this year, we released a study Bible with a lot of the notes and stuff that came out of all that teaching over those many years. It's been a very, very exciting thing.
And so that's a discipline that you follow that you don't get if you're just choosing particular topics in which to preach.
I know that a lot of people tell me you can't keep a congregation interested for more than 6 or 8 weeks on a certain topic. But that's making the assumption that the Bible is uninteresting and dull and always about the same thing. I mean, in the book of Mark especially, Mark was the first eyewitness to the life of Christ, and I think was probably Peter's amanuensis who recorded all of Peter's thoughts. And Mark is an exciting book. I mean, Did you know most famous word in the book of Mark is immediately? It's in there 42 times. And every time you turn around, Mark is jumping off into something else. So if you think it's boring, it's not boring. If it's boring, because we make it boring, but it's not boring. And last week I taught on Mark chapter 10 on, just get this, you guys, listen to this. Jesus predicts he's going to die in the most verbal, visual prediction of what's going to happen. He's going to be killed, he's going to be mocked, he's going to be scourged, they're going to kill him, and he's going to rise the third day. And what would you think the disciples would say after that? James and John said, could we sit one of us at the right hand and the other at the left hand? I mean, can you hear, what a disconnect. And Jesus, he took advantage of that to give them a lesson on true greatness. True greatness is service. Yeah. So that's what the book of Mark is about. It's about Jesus and his life. And man, I get so excited about that. It's really very difficult for me when I go to do a topical series and I have to leave the consecutive exposition of the scripture. But I do it because I know it's important to do.
Yeah. We'll turn to your questions in a moment. One more right now. 4 grown children you have, 11 grandchildren.
Well, my wife should tell you 11 and a half.
11 and a half?
Yeah.
Okay. At this point, when you think of your grandchildren, what are you afraid of?
What am I afraid of? You know, Marvin, when I read my book after I'd written it, I realized that in every chapter I'd had some of the same fear that everybody else has. Interestingly enough, for whatever it's worth, the most important, the most often repeated exhortation in the Bible is not love one another, it's fear not. And over 200 people in the Bible, we are told they were afraid. And we all have been afraid. And when I look at the future, it's hard to imagine if we have the same amount of erosion that's happened during my lifetime. It's hard to imagine what it will be like for our children. I wish there was something I could do to reverse that. And part of what we do as pastors and leaders is we try to do everything we can to provide a culture that can be more conducive to your own children raising their children. But I fear the constant intrusion into the life of the family and into the life of the church, of the government, and all the things that are happening. I fear that we may not have enough strong leaders to withstand that and enough courage to stand up and say, that's enough, no more. I don't know what else to say about that. You see, one of the ladies I interviewed when I was doing this book told me that her greatest fear was when she took her kids to the bus stop every morning. She would let them get on the bus, and she said, as I got in my car to drive home, she said I would just have an incredible panic attack because I was afraid something would happen to those kids while they were out of my sight. And I'd be afraid like that all the day until I went and picked them up at night. And then she said that I would be okay for a few hours and then would start all over the next day. You would be surprised how many people go through that. And that's a new thing that's in our generation that we didn't have when I was growing up.
Yeah. Microphones on both sides, so raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Over here. See, this isn't radio. We can actually wait a few seconds.
So you mentioned that your main relationship to your flock is through the pulpit, and that because your church is so large that the task of ministering to people relationally is somewhat delegated. So roughly, how do you divide your time between preparing for your sermons and all the things with the books and whatnot, and pouring into those people who then pour into your flock?
You know, that's a very difficult question to answer, but let me give it a shot. I try to spend as much time as I can in my study. I remember as a young student at Dallas Seminary, one time I had an opportunity to visit with Dr. W.A. Criswell, who was the famed pastor of the First Baptist Church, and he said something to me I never forgot. He said, David, if you give your mornings to God, you can stay in any church you want for as long as you want. And what he was saying is if you want to be a long-term pastor, you got to make study a priority, because you'll run out of material and you'll have to go and recycle it someplace else. And so I've made that a priority, and especially since I've been in California, I've really had to fight for that. And then I meet with our guys. We have 14 guys that are kind of the group that help us do what we do. I have lunch with them every Wednesday, and we spend several hours together. And I spend time with them individually for various and sundry reasons, and try to encourage them. And we do, for instance, when we did the thing in New York recently with the Bible, all of those guys and their wives came, and we had a great time together. And so I try to build them up and encourage them as much as I can, and so that's a high priority. And you know, one of the raps on large churches is that the pastor is turned into a CEO instead of a shepherd. And that's something you have to watch out for. So you try to find great administrative people to come and help you. And I believe that's really the key, is finding the right people, finding people who can take these things that could just eat your lunch if you let them. For instance, right now we're building a major building on our campus, a 100,000 square foot, a $20 million facility. And I have a guy on my staff who's a former Marine who understands this process, and he is running it. I have about a 10-minute conversation with him every week so he can tell me what's going on. I don't know. I don't get into it because I can't. I want it in my head. I know he knows what he's doing. He's got a trustee board that works with him on it, so I can release that. And I think that's the biggest key, is finding people you can get rid of stuff that would normally take up your time so you can do the thing that only you can do. My concept of the church, especially the church like ours, is I can fail in a lot of things, but I can't fail as a teacher. I cannot let that happen. If I fail as a teacher, then that's the one thing I do that has the greatest possibility of helping people. So I've got to make that my priority.
I am a resident of Southern California also. And so what we see a lot of times, especially growing up in a ministry family in Southern California, is kind of a disconnect between churches and how they work together, or the ministries that they do. And that's kind of indicative of the entire nation and the evangelical ministry as a whole. But especially in Southern California, there seems to be kind of like a disconnect between churches. They're kind of in their own bubbles, you know?
Yeah.
So I was wondering what ministries your church has that works with other churches, or how you could see a fix to that problem.
Well, what he's saying is such a true thing, because most churches are like a universe of their own, and they look at all the issues they have to deal with, and then somebody comes along and says, we want you to help us do our thing, and you look, you got to be kidding me. You want us to help you? We don't got enough time to do what we're doing. And so it has to be an issue that really grabs hold of everybody. For instance, since you're from Southern California, you're probably familiar with the Proposition 8 thing we all went through. We were totally involved with each other during that time, helping each other, encouraging one another, trying to get that thing straightened out. But it has to be an issue that's across the whole board, that has an impact on every church. It can't just be, everybody wants you to help them with their issue. But that doesn't work, because everybody's got their own issues. Everybody's got their own initiative. And we share together prayer breakfasts in San Diego. We do other things in San Diego. But I'll be honest with you, when you're in a church of some size, that becomes a very difficult. We're a part of the Southern Baptist Convention. And to be honest with you, we have very little connection with the other Southern Baptist churches in the community, because there are not very many of them. And especially is what you're saying true when you're involved in a church plant, because a church plant usually is understaffed and underfunded, and it takes every ounce of you that you got to give just to survive the daily needs that you're facing trying to move that church forward. So we do lose some of the cooperative juice that we once might have had in days past.
Yeah, there we go. What theologians have influenced you? That's one question. And the other question was, you're preaching on consecutive passages and books in the Scripture, which I find very encouraging. Do you find many do that? And if not, why not? And the theologian question.
One of my friends is a guy named Paige Patterson, who's the president of Southwestern Seminary, which is in Fort Worth.
Oh, Southwestern. He was Southeastern. Now
he was
Southwestern.
Yeah. And he's on the board at Cedarville College, and I'm on that board. And when I was just at this board meeting, he came up and he goes, he's a very dramatic guy. He worked for Dr. Criswell, and Dr. Criswell was a very dramatic person. If he would write you a letter, it would be so flowery you would wonder who would write such a letter. But he comes up to me in this meeting and he goes, Dr. Jeremiah, you can never die. And I looked at him, he said, because nobody's preaching through the Bible anymore, you can never die. Well, what he was saying was, you know, not very many people do that. I'm not the only one who does it by any means, but that used to be the way people did church until we got all the market research and the felt needs and all the stuff that you mentioned earlier. So I guess maybe I am a little bit of an anomaly in that respect. As to the theologians, I love Plantinga. I read everything I can get that he writes. I like him. And, you know, I went to Dallas Seminary, so I sat under John Walvoord and Charles Ryrie and guys like that who made a great impact on my life, Dwight Pentecost. Contemporary theologians, I don't know that I have a favorite one of those, but those are the people that have impacted my life.
It's a mistake of mine, I think, anytime I think that Paige Patterson could be wrong. But let's say he is wrong here. What is your succession plan?
Oh, no, don't ask me that one. You know, that's the big elephant in the room, isn't it? In fact, there's a book being written about that right now. In fact, I just saw some of the early galleys of it, and they listed the age of pastors who are pastors of large churches. And unfortunately, I'm on that list. You know, there's two ways to think about succession. Number one, the Lord brought you here, and when he's done with you here, he'll bring somebody else here. That's kind of how some people think. Well, I got to San Diego because Tim LaHaye came after me. In over a 2-year period of time, he came after me, and then the church, he quit and went to Washington, and then the church came after me, and then I came. But I can tell you success stories and disaster stories for every kind of transitional model there is. For instance, in Dallas, when Dr. Criswell retired, that is a horror story. You don't want to even go there. There's been a whole book written by one of the successors on it, and it's just, it was awful. And he tried to manage the succession himself, to bring in somebody, put his mantle on him, and say, this guy's going to be my successor. Something similar happened at the Bellevue Church where Adrian Rogers was for many years, and he put his mantle on the man who's still there, but he went through a terrible transitional time to get there. We've talked about it a lot. We don't have anything written out, but it is obviously a very important thing for us to be considering, and that's about all I can say. You know, between saying we have a transitional plan and at the same time saying I still love to do what I do and I don't mean to quit very soon, there's a big space there where there's some answers that need to be gathered.
Other questions?
Jeremiah, thanks so much for being here, and thank you for your ministry. Most mornings on my drive in, I'm listening to you on the radio, and was very encouraged by the series you did on what is heaven like. And I'm just curious what prompts a theme like that in the beginning, and then how you begin to approach that through your study and research.
Well, first of all, I have a lot of funerals, and people want to know about heaven. You know, they want to know, is it real? And I think Jesus said a lot about heaven, and there's a lot in the Bible about heaven. So You know, I don't know if you've read Randy Alcorn's book on heaven, which is basically the standard encyclopedia of everything you ever wanted to know about heaven.
A really good book.
Incredible book, and it was a bestseller, and it's that thick. But I wanted to do something that could be helpful to people who were investing their friends in heaven, and I wanted to do it in a way that would be interesting to people. So I just studied heaven for about a year and a half, and then I put together this series, and I tried to make it as interesting as possible. I did a whole message, for instance, on what about the children? What happens when a child dies before they're at an age where they can accept Christ? I did another message called God's Extreme Makeover, which is what happens to your body before you go to heaven. I try to find one of my favorite messages is why heaven won't be boring, because when you get changed, you won't be boring anymore, nor will anybody else be. And for one thing, God isn't boring. So I did a whole thing on that. I try to find all the questions that people have asked me over the years about heaven, or I'm not going to go to heaven, it's going to be boring, I'm going to go to the other place with all my friends. And I try to disabuse them about the fact that when you go to hell, there won't be any friends, there won't be any relationships at all, because that's what hell is all about. It's total isolation. It's like being in an isolated cell for the rest of your eternity. So I just tried to do that and answer those questions, and I gave those messages in the church. I've never written a book out of it. Maybe since everybody's so interested, I should think about that. But and then we put it on the radio. And here's a little marketing thing we did that some of my guys came up with. They said, let's take a bunch of questions about heaven and put them in a little gift book, and just have the question at the top and as concise an answer at the bottom as possible. So we did a little gift book called Questions About Heaven, Questions You Have About Heaven. And we went through 78,000 of those books in the first month it was on the air. It was like we couldn't believe what happened. People just wanted answers, and they wanted in a way that they can grab it. So that series really surprised us. We didn't expect that to happen, and it just did. It was just a subject people wanted to know about.
Dr. Jeremiah, I'd like to convey to you love and thanks from my sister Kathy and her husband Ken. My brother-in-law has Parkinson's disease and has become more limited, so he can't get out to church. And so they listen to you on Sundays, but every other day too. And you have nourished them so much. So my thanks and love too. Thank you.
Well, that's really encouraging. You know, that's we try to tell people don't ever use Turning Point Radio or television as an excuse not to go to church. And I say that every Friday on my radio program. We are not an excuse for you not to go to church. Go to church this week. On the other hand, there's a lot of people that can't go to church. And so we can be there for them, and that's really cool. We love that.
Praise the Lord for your ministry, because in Rhode Island we were in a liberal church, and I would get up at 5:30 in the morning and listen to you. I didn't know who you were, but you preached the Word of God, and it just helped us through getting out of that church. And my son-in-law had just accepted the Lord, and it was great hearing the Word of God.
Thank you.
And I have a question. I'm so glad my son told me that you were going to be here. I'm living up in Boston now, but I wanted to make a point to hear you. How do you, I know, like you said, you spend the morning in the Word of God and developing your studies and so forth, and your time alone with the Lord. How do you organize? You've got all these people you meet with, your family, your grandchildren, to see that they're saved, and how do you do it all?
Well, I do it imperfectly.
So do I.
I'm sure of that. I'm going to tell you a little story, and this isn't in the script, but maybe this will help you. When I first started, I'm probably like a lot of people in this room. You go to college, you go to get ready to do what you're going to do, and you get dumped out into the world, and you want to succeed. You don't want to be a failure. You don't want to have everybody looking at you saying, So when we started that church in Fort Wayne, Don and I had we had just had our first child, which we adopted, and then 13 months later we had our first son, which wasn't adopted. So we had 2 children, 2 small children, and I was trying to start this church, and as I've already mentioned, I was out in homes almost every night sharing the gospel. It suddenly hit me one day that I was the gross national product of the church, and if I didn't do it, it wasn't going to get done. I didn't have any helpers really much there, and so I was, if you haven't picked it up, I'm sort of a type A, and so I was going to do everything I could to make sure that we did this well. I'm not even sure all my motivations were pure. I just know what was going on. So over a period of time, I'd work hard all day and I'd come home for dinner, and we had these 2 little kids, and my wife would say, "Are you going to be gone again tonight?" And I would give her a little speech about how, honey, it's me. If I don't do it, it's not going to get done, and we got to build this church. And, and so to make a long story short, one day I came home and she said, "We need to talk. If you're not married yet and that ever happens to you, let me just tell you, you're just about to have a serious conversation." And so we went out in the kitchen and we sat down at the table, and this is what she told me. She said, "Honey, I know God has called you to do what you do, and I believe in it. But," she said, "I also know He's called you to be a husband and a father." And she says, "I don't know what to do." She says, when I ask you about this, sometimes I feel like I'm fighting against God." So she said, "I'll tell you what I've decided. I've been praying about this, and this is what I told the Lord." I said, "I'm not ever going to tell you again that you need to be home. I'm going to leave that between you and God. You and God are going to have to work this out. And someday you're going to have to give an account, not only what kind of pastor you were, but what kind of father you were, what kind of husband you were." And I don't know how to tell you this any other way, but it broke my heart. And I was never the same. And looking back over my shoulder, it made it possible for me to say to you today, all my grown children are my best friends. I had 2 boys that played college football on the East Coast, and I was a pastor on the West Coast. I went to every game over a period of about 8 years. Somehow, I got somebody to get me to preach in their church on Friday, and I went to the football game on Saturday and went home and preached on Sunday. I didn't miss any of the important things in my kids, and so I can tell you, I can't tell you this about a lot of things, but I can tell you I did not sacrifice my family in order to be a pastor. And in the process, one of the great things that happened was I was able to model that for the guys that were around me. The guys around my staff know if their kids got a ball game in the middle of the day someplace, I don't expect them to be at work. Go to the game. That's one of the privileges of having a little more flexible schedule. But your kids need you to be there at important times in their lives. Now, the real challenge for that is I now have 11 grandchildren, and they have the same expectations, and I'm not sure how I'm going to do that. I kind of pick and choose on that one and realize the parents got to do their own part there. I think that's one of the things that's happened over the years in churches where you have a guy who's trying to make a difference, is that he ends up sacrificing everything else in order to do that. And especially if you're a pastor, that's the worst example you could ever show to your people. So I have to tell you that my wife is the catalyst who made that work, and we look back at that moment as one of the most important moments in our marriage.
Yes, sir. I'm a pastor here in the area of a church plant we started about 5 years ago. And one of the things I do on Monday morning is I try to watch 2 or 3 other preachers and watch you frequently there on the TV and study how they preach and just try to incorporate different things into the way that I preach the Word of God. And question about the way you prepare your sermons, it almost appears sometimes like the sermons you preach are manuscripted, like you're reading the notes, and there's a lot of other different styles. How did you develop the style of preaching that you do publicly from the pulpit?
When I was a pastor in Fort Wayne for 12 years, I did not use notes hardly at all. and I don't read the sermons. I do have a very robust manuscript, and it's not word for word, but it's the gist of what I'm going to say. I think what happened when I started doing the thing on radio, I became conscious of the important nature of words. I think when I was doing it before, you kind of get into a routine where you maybe overuse words, or you don't use them correctly, or you throw in little euphemisms that probably don't. So when I came to California in 1981, I made a covenant that I would manuscript everything I ever preached before I preached it. I don't use the manuscript necessarily word for word, but I use it as the core of what I'm going to say. And I really believe that's been a good thing for me, and it's been a great thing for what we do across the board, because the content is not subject to interpretation. It's there, and there's a lot of different thoughts about that. Everybody's got to do what they feel comfortable with.
We're going to have to cut it off right here, but I want to thank all of you for coming. I hope some of you will come tomorrow at 12:20 to learn everything you might want to know about the Balkans, one of the cockpits of the world these days, and will be started World War I 100 years ago, this June 28th, 2014, the 100th anniversary of the assassination that touched off World War I. So I hope you'll be back tomorrow to hear about the Balkans, and right now, please join me in thanking Dr. Jeremiah for coming today.